Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Richness of Southern Soils, Supporting Black Farming and Food, which is a part of GIA's Move the Money series. My name is Jamie Sharp, and I am the program manager here for Grantmakers in the Arts. I use she, they pronouns, and I am a light-skinned black femme with a short afro, dangly blue earrings, and a white collared shirt. GIA is headquartered on the unceded land of the Lenape and Wappinger peoples. We ask you to join in acknowledging the Lenape and Wappinger communities, their elders both past and present, as well as future generations. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment of beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Before we begin our webinar, please take a minute to review the Zoom features so you have an optimal experience with us today. If you have a question for our technical team during the webinar, feel free to use the chat function and message Grantmakers in the Arts or LGC Tech. Otherwise, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit questions for the presenters. If you would like your experience to include live captioning, select the closed caption option or CC feature in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen and select show subtitles. Cuisine stands as a cornerstone of cultural identity, yet it's predominantly commercialized within the private market, unlike other artistic forms that receive backing from both public and philanthropic realms. This discrepancy largely stems from historical neglect of the invaluable contributions to American culinary heritage made by communities of the global majority, who have also endured land dispossession. Specifically, sustainable farming traditions rooted in African heritage, which are being reclaimed by Black communities in their struggle to address disproportionate food insecurity. Today, we will hear from Carlton Turner and Kolu Zigbee about the movement for Black cultural and economic self-determination in the South through land access, food production, and Black Southern cuisine and community. Now I just want to go over an overview a little bit for today of our webinar. So we're doing intros right now, then we will hear from Carlton and Kolu. After both of their presentations, we'll have a bit of time for an audience Q&A, and then we'll shift into breakout room discussions, just with some questions to really get us going on this content. We'll have a group share, and then we will close out for the day. And now I will hand it off to Eddie Torres to give us just a little bit more context around GIA's Move the Money series.
Thank you so much, Jamie, and thank you all for joining us. I'm Eddie Torres. I'm the president of Grantmakers in the Arts. I use we, us pronouns. I appear as a cisgendered male with dark hair and eyes and a white beard. I'm wearing glasses and a light-colored blazer. Thank you for joining this collaboration between Grantmakers in the Arts and Art.coop. The goal of our racial equity work is intersectional economic and social justice through cultural change. Replacing notions of cultural inferiority with cultural self-determination and the financing of cultural self-determination is one way toward moving into an increasingly just economic system. Replace the notion of cultural inferiority, and we replace the dehumanization and separation that facilitates economic exploitation, facilitating instead economic self-determination. To address root causes rather than symptoms of inequity, grantmakers can follow the lead of BIPOC creatives who are innovating models for self-determination and community wealth through cultural expression and solidarity economies. The solidarity economy is one that centers community ownership and democratic governance that builds political, cultural, and economic power for workers. So we're here to learn from examples of cultural and economic self-determination. So it's in that spirit that I am honored to hand it off to founder and principal of Zigbee Consulting and facilitator of the Southern Black Farmers Community-Led Fund, Kolu Zigbee. Kolu.
Thanks so much, Eddie. Hello, everyone. My name is Kolu Zigbee, and I use she, her pronouns. I am a brown-skinned, upper middle-aged woman, or maybe elder would be more accurate. I am wearing some headphones and a colorful top, And I'm excited to be here because I haven't had the opportunity to speak with arts and culture funders in the past. I do have a history in sort of organized philanthropy. I'm going to say a little bit about myself and then share a brief video about the fund that we're talking about, the Southern Black Farmers Community-Led Fund, and then provide some context about sort of situating this sort of intersectional work of family and community-based farming, food systems, community building, and self-determination within the context of philanthropy. And then a little bit about our process for grant making, because we are pretty radical, I think. So in terms of myself, I am the granddaughter of Black farmers. In particular, West African. My people are Loma from the Upper Guinea rainforest, and they did subsistence farming and upland rice farming. And I grew up in New York City, but I had the good fortune to visit my ancestral village and see what people can do when they work together in terms of feeding themselves, providing their own housing, clothing, creativity, music, pleasure, and was really moved to bring those values into the grant making that I did for 20 years in organized philanthropy, where I managed a portfolio around sustainable agriculture and food systems, and was fortunate that the theory of change at the foundation where I worked was people power. And that meant that we funded organizing and grassroots advocacy of organizations that were led by farmers. And at the time, 85% of the groups we funded were predominantly white-led. And I went on a journey to figure out how to diversify that portfolio. And by the time I left in 2020, the statistics were inverted. And it gave me the opportunity to get to know many of the people of color-led organizations engaged in the work of humanizing our deeply problematic and exploitative and extractive food system. The food system is the site of some of the most egregious extraction of wealth that happens in our economy. It is one of the largest or the largest labor sector, and it has the lowest hourly wages. So it is the place where wealth extraction happens nowadays. And in January of 2020, I left the foundation to work as a consultant, and I was approached by RSF Social Finance, which manages donor-advised funds, to help them meet the desires of a major donor experienced with farm and food system funding, who wanted to cede power over grant-making decisions to people closer to the work, and in particular to Black farmers. And it was through that effort that I designed and came to facilitate the Southern Black Farmers Community-Led Fund. Our fund meets monthly, and the advisors, who are all practitioners, they all work directly, I would say with grassroots organizations, directly with folks on the ground, with farmers. Several of them are farmers themselves. And when we meet, they share about what they're seeing in the community, in the region. Majority of Black farmers are in the South. I guess I'll let the video speak for itself and then provide a little more context. Cue to video.
I do this work because I feel I'm called to do it. I feel that it's my duty to be supporting Black farmers and ensure that they have everything that they need to live and be well and also be whole. So many things have happened to Black farmers that are not right. by any means, and I feel that it's in my power to make something different and build an alternative.
Nature provides for us and is deeply a part of our cultural inheritance.
I come from a lineage of farmers, of land workers, of herbalists, and have been one generation disconnected, and I'm returning, realizing what support is needed, especially for young farmers who are in the South, coming from the South, have stayed in the South. I just want to be a part of developing different ways to engage with young folks so they are looking for land, trying to find ways to build up their business.
I'm passionate about building people power. I myself am not a farmer. I started my career off as an organizer, both union and community cooperatives, something very essential. It brings people together in a structure, helps them become more organized.
I care so much about our community, and especially about our ability to have self-determination. With everything that's going on in the world, Black America, and especially Blacks in rural America, have got to decide for themselves how they're going to figure out their own economic opportunity for their children and families.
The Southern Black Farmers Community-Led Fund.
So I think a lot of times there's this myth that because of the trauma of enslavement and the injustices around the subsequent sharecropping system and virulent racism in the South, that Black people don't want to engage in agriculture, don't want to farm. And actually what we're seeing is that there's a burgeoning back to the land movement where young farmers and beginning farmers are looking to agriculture, not just because they want to be farmers, but because they want to feed their communities. The disproportionate nutrition-related illnesses that affect Black families is one of the really strong impetus for young people to get into farming. The high incidences of anxiety and mental and emotional illness, the healing that comes from being on the land, and the desire to provide space for folks to come back to the land for a sense of wholeness and also community, and the control that you get when you operate your own farm are all some of the reasons. It's certainly not primarily economic. It has to do with individual independence, but also very much so it's within the tradition of marronage, or Black folks within the context of anti-Blackness, creating safe spaces where they can thrive and they can be their full selves and engage in Black joy. And I think that is a lot of the reason that we're seeing so many Black folks, and particularly young Black folks, wanting to engage in farming. There's tremendous obstacles because of the commodification of not just food, but land, and land is very expensive. Because of racial discrimination around lending practices, and also a history of heirs property, fractionated ownership of land in the Black community is, there's a lot of that where it's not just owned within families with a simple title to the land, but there may be multiple family members who have a fraction of the ownership. All of these things are obstacles to young farmers and farmers just owning land that they can create these sort of self-governing spaces and communities of creativity. And one of the things that I want to just highlight is that there are a lot of reasons. There's a great role for philanthropy to help organizations like the organizations that anchor the Southern Black Farmers Community-Led Fund, help farmers overcome those obstacles. But there's some barriers within philanthropy to doing that. And so one is, I think, a bias against funding in the South that is beginning to shift. We're seeing it shift, but there is evidence that it's still quite significant. There's been articles, and I will follow up. I think we're going to follow up with some resources. So I'll share detailed resources where you can see reports about this, but Grantmakers for Southern Partners and the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy several years ago did a series called As the South Goes. It was a 4-part series that documented disproportionately low levels of philanthropic support from philanthropy in the South. And there's also been reports about low levels of philanthropic support for arts in the South. So that's one thing, is the South doesn't get its fair share of funding. And then rural America in general is overlooked. And Black-led organizations are also underfunded. Echoing Green did a study where they looked at Black-led organizations of their fellows and found that on average, they were receiving funding levels 24% smaller than the revenues of their white-led counterparts. And then farmers, and especially Black farmers, also, or farmer-led organizations, and especially Black farmer-led organizations also are disproportionately underfunded. So you add up all those things, and there's a lot of opportunity to fill the gaps, to make up for that underfunding, because it is a very exciting space for problem solving. Farmers are problem solvers. They generally wear multiple hats. They have to know how to do everything. And the truth is that the vision that they often have for their land is really, especially for the farmers that we see, is not just about making money. It's about listening to the land and discovering how to be co-creative with it. And I think that's part of the cultural piece, where we think of farming as just an economic enterprise, where really it is a cultural expression of how we can be in right relationship with the earth and with other beings in the earth. So you see farmers leaving areas of their land just for biodiversity, for the animals, for the ancestors. There's a recognition of First Peoples' stewardship of the land. There's a recognition of the ancestral practices. So there's a term that was coined by Blaine Snipstall from the Black Dirt Collective, which is in the Mid-Atlantic area, which is Afroecology. And so it's kind of playing off the term agroecology, but really with recognition that for Black people, these agroecological practices are not just how we interact with the earth and agricultural production, but how we interact with our ancestors and with each other. And so for many, it's beyond an economic, and it's beyond just a cultural even expression. It's really a spiritual expression. And as a fund, we do practical work, right? We've done well over $3 million in grant making since we've started. We've got almost about the same amount ahead of us to go, at least. We're still fundraising. And I'd like to share a little bit about our participatory grant making practice. So I'll ask that that slide be shared. So first of all, the grounding. We meet monthly. We spent about 4 months when we first got started just sharing with each other about our organizations, their history, their values, their strategies, so we could really know each other. And the interesting thing is that everyone knew of each other's organizations. Many folks had even done some work together, but that's different than really spending the time to deeply get to know one another. We do meet in person at least once a year, and that reflective process, that grounding is, I like to call it it's like a landscape analysis every time we meet. But it's personalized. It's not done by experts. It's, you know, something that we share with each other based on their own experiences on the ground. With that, you know, we move into, and it's not necessarily so sequential, right? Some of this is happening simultaneously, but based on that sharing, we are able to have kind of a high level view of what's happening and an analysis of what we see as really successful that needs to be built upon, and also where the gaps are. You know, what isn't happening. One of the gaps that we identified was this really key piece around legacy extension, because you know, farmers, like, you know, it's a generational demographic shift with baby boomers aging out, and that's happening in the farm community as well. And in the Black community, it's even more intensified. The average age of Black farmers is a little higher than the average age of farmers in general. And the question of how to connect young folks really interested in entering farming who may not have that background and the experience, and also the land, with the farmers who are aging out, and how to facilitate that connection was a gap that we saw, that we have begun to fill by creating a Southern Youth Agrarian Network, SAYN. And we have an agrarian network coordinator that we funded, and that's come out of our analysis. Our process of deliberation is really about talking through what we see, what we want to fund. So unlike a lot of participatory grant making, we actually also fund our own organizations. We don't see that as a conflict of interest. We see that as a building of mutual interest and accountability. We also fund partner organizations, and we fund our own collaborations. So again, where we see those gaps or opportunities where two or more groups can work together, we're able to fund that and make that happen. And then the final administration is supported by RSF Social Finance. So we have an application. Once we have deliberated and identified what and who we want to fund, we actually invite a very simple, it's basically a Google form. It's like maybe one-page form, and gets the basic information, and that is to validate, you know, sort of what we think we're seeing, what we've understood through our deliberation, and also to have the documentation, the written documentation. And then with that, we're able to contact, or, you know, make the request through RSF Social Finance, which actually holds the money. We're considered a field of interest fund within RSF. We have 2 major donors, and we're looking to grow that number of donors. And so with that, I guess the last thing that I'll say is that with the poly crisis that we're facing, the food system is really imperiling our planet. It's not the only problem. We have a problem with racialized late-stage capitalism. We have pollution. We have, you know, just racism and poverty and all of that. And so farms, collective farms, you know, these are not agribusiness. These are small, diversified, really experiments in how we might live into the future in ways that are more harmonious and mutualistic. And so now I'm gonna hand it over to Carlton Turner, who is the co-executive director of the Mississippi Center for Cultural Production, to give you an on-the-ground view of what that looks like.
Thank you so much, Kolu. Thank you for sharing all that information with us. My name is Carlton Turner. I am, as Kolu said, the co-director and co-founder of the Mississippi Center for Cultural Production. We also go by the name SIP Culture, and I'm just going to share a little bit about the work that we do and about how our work fits inside of the Southern Black Farmers Community-Led Fund. So this first picture is a picture of my mother, and this is a cotton field that is close to our home in Mississippi. The community I live in, Utica, Mississippi, is where my family has been for 8 generations. And my mother, this particular field is a field that they plant cotton. It's also a Confederate battle memorial. And we chose to do a photo shoot there because we wanted to hear these stories from my mother about her upbringing and growing up in Mississippi. And she had a lot of stories about the cotton field. This one particular story was about, I wrote about, I wrote an article called Who's Cotton You Chopping? And she talked about going to the field at the age of 5 years old and how her mother didn't want her to go, but her grandfather was like, let the girl go. If she want to go to the field, let her go to the field. So he took a hoe that was broken and cut it down to her size to where she could carry her own small hoe out to the cotton fields and chop cotton. And so for many years, I was very upset about this story because I was like, well, my mama, chopping cotton at 5 years old. And at some point in my adult life, probably within the last 15 years, I asked my mother to tell me more about that story and to tell me whose field was it that she was chopping cotton on, because I wanted to understand. I really wanted to understand who to be upset with because so many families in this community are still here. The kind of the legacy families that have been here for a long time. And she said, what do you mean who field? It was our field. We were growing cotton for ourselves. This is our commercial enterprise as the family. And so it totally shifted my understanding of what her experience was growing up in Mississippi. We are taught so much about plantations and this whole framework of how our communities are built. But she was telling me that she was chopping cotton on their own family land, and then she began to tell me the story about how that enterprise failed because of access to the markets, and how that changed the trajectory of our family. The inability to monetize our land because of not having access to the markets. And it reminds me of this story being a part of a larger story in Mississippi, where Mississippi had the highest concentration and still has the highest concentration of Black landowners in the country. But so much of it has been stolen over generations, and it has changed the dynamics of wealth building and wealth generation in Black communities in the South, and specifically in Mississippi. So SIP culture focuses on what we call comprehensive community cultural development. And for us, what that means is our community issues and challenges and joys are comprehensive. They're not one item issues. And our work as an organization is to work to harness the imagination and the creativity in our community in designing our communities or redesigning our communities for the 21st century. We do that through focusing on community engaged design as a primary tool and process for which we do our community work. And what that means is that we start with community. It's community input that influences and designs the way that we move. Our work started with a number of community conversations in which we were asking the community a series of questions. Where do you work? Where do you live? Where do you shop? And where do you worship? And those responses to those questions helped us to understand that our community had turned from a cultural center, a place of cultural production, to one of a bedroom community. We did these conversations in conjunction with designers and architects. And so we were able to translate the conversations with the community into direct responses that are designing and using the built infrastructure in our community to address those concerns. We work through cultural production. And what we mean by cultural production is the ability to produce the culture that we want to be connected to. That means producing our stories. That means producing, in many ways, the arts and the narratives that are representative of our community. It also means producing food. And food production is a big part of the work that we do as a community. The first thing that people identified was the lack of access to fresh food in our community as being a tremendous handicap in having a real opportunity to have an influence on the trajectory of our lives. And so one of the things that we began to do was to focus on thinking about community development as this framework that impacts the lives of 4 living generations. So if our work isn't impacting the lives of the community members, then we need to continue to evolve and refine that process, because that's ultimately what our work is about. It's about creating better communities. It's about creating a community that is more comprehensive to the needs that our members of our community are experiencing. And so we do that through a series of programs. One is called our Rural Performance Production Lab. And that particular program focuses on supporting artists in residency through the development of their projects. We work in a 5-state region. So we support artists in Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee with direct funding, with advisors and consultancies. And we provide them with residencies at the White Oak Artist Residency, which is one of our 4 properties here in Utica, Mississippi. And Utica is a very small town of under 1,000 people in the town center, about 4,500 people in the zip code. And we work with the community to set up an infrastructure for rural design that includes this artist residency house that is 104 years old, and we've been renovating this home to be an artist space and also an office space. We also have a program called the DigiCulture Lab, and that program focuses on working with young people to develop a sense of understanding the basic forms of agricultural production as well as narrative development. So they learn the tools of storytelling and digital media. They learn how to shoot photography. They learn how to shoot video. They learn how to do audio interviews and to put all of those things together to be more and direct a relationship to shaping their own narrative. As digital creators, they're more in charge of the way that their lives show up in the media world. And we see that as a crucial element of the work that our community needs to do. The larger community of our young people who are really exposed more than any generation has ever been. And they also learn how to grow food, which most of them, this is their first introduction to understanding plant science at the level of like hands-on experience. We also have a farm. We have 17 acres of green space on which we have a 2-acre vegetable production facility, as well as an 1,800 square foot greenhouse. We train farmers in traditional, what we call traditional or sustainable and regenerative farming practices through our small farmer apprentice program. And that program takes folks who don't have any experience in farming and teaches them the fundamentals of farming to where they can begin to develop their own food production enterprises. One of the big issues in our community is that we don't have a grocery store. So before we start moving into a place of developing or trying to figure out economically how to support a grocery store, we wanted to start what our community already knows how to do. We know how to grow food. So creating these infrastructures allows us to really focus on the development of all of the aspects of cultural development. We do this work specifically on the Sip Culture Community Farm in partnership with a number of institutions, including this organization, the Southern Black Farmers Community Led Fund, where we sit as an anchor institution and help to do the trust-based philanthropy grant making that happens here. We also work with the Southern Rural Black Women's in Agriculture, where we grow their transplants for 9 Black women-led farms in the Mississippi Delta. We work with the Alcorn State Extension Services at Alcorn State University, which is in Lorman, the oldest historically Black college and university land grant institution. We work with the Southeastern African American Farmers Organic Network, otherwise known as SAFON, who also works with the Southern Black Farmers Community Led Fund, and also the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, of which I sit on the leadership team. And all of these institutions work towards the development of Black food infrastructures across the entire country, with some of them focusing primarily on the U.S. South. And the last organization on this is the Braiding Seeds Fellowship, which is a collaborative fellowship program between Soul Fire Farm and the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. We also sit as an anchor member of that organization to help provide space for those fellowships to take place. We focus that work, in building these institutions and these infrastructures for the development through this rural campus. I talked about the farm, I talked about the White Oak Artist Residency, and this is the Main Street Cultural Center. We started a capital campaign in November to build out this building in which we've been planning and designing for more than 3 years. this space will house both a cultural center and a commercial kitchen. The commercial kitchen will be the conduit by which all of the food that we're growing will come through this particular space, and that's how the community will have access to it, whether it's fresh food or food that is created in the value added process, or food that is cooked to have fresh meals for our community. This is a central building that has been in our community for more than 100 years, but for the last 20 years has not been a viable business. So these infrastructure improvements go a long way in changing the reality of our community. And all of this, arts and culture, culinary, food, agriculture, all of these things are intertwined. They're not separate from each other. And that's something that I think is really important for us to just understand as grant makers, is that this work is not separated. It is very much an intentional and connected, piece of work that we have to think about as we do our strategies. The last thing I'll talk about is Homegrown Utica. So we're working with the One Nation, One Project to do one of the 18 cities that will be a part of this event that's happening on July 27th. So we've been organizing with our community for the last 2 years, and our community decided to do a food access festival. And so as part of that, we've developed the Homegrown Utica Festival as a framework for really a new way of thinking about our community and the way that we do our work together. The Homegrown Utica Festival will happen on July 27th. And as part of that, we both created the festival as a vehicle for organizing our community into making decisions together. And we've created from this 2 things that are really important. One is the Homegrown Utica brand. So the Homegrown Utica brand will live beyond the festival and really can be used to acknowledge the things that we do in our community, the things that we're growing, the things that we're producing, so that the community can begin to see itself in a more comprehensive light in terms of what we're contributing as a cultural producer in the community of Utica and in this region. And we also created a community food club, which ultimately will yield itself and become a community food cooperative. And that food cooperative is responsible for buying in bulk, for having and establishing relationships with farmers and bringing that food in through the community cultural center. So this is Mississippi, where creativity is everywhere, including the food, which is joy, and which is really a home base for storytelling. So this is really the type of work that we support through the Southern Black Farmer Community-Led Fund, the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, and I just really am glad that we have an opportunity to share this work with you today and the work that I do with COLU. So thank you all so much, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Carlton, and COLU as well. We just want to take a pause here. Please feel free, folks who are attending, to drop any questions that you have in the chat for either of our guests. And we'll just, take a pause for a moment. And COLU and Carlton, please, if there's anything else that you would like to add on or other things that are coming up as we discuss this content.
I'll just say, I know that was a lot of information, so please, if you have any specific questions that you would like to get more in-depth answers to, I could definitely share more specific information about a lot of the things that I talked about.
So we do have a question here in the chat from Eddie Torres. Read biases against funding in the South. Have you seen any change over the years, positive or negative?
I think we can probably both speak to that a little bit, Carlton. I'll say that I think there's been some positive changes, especially after sort of the summer of racial reckoning, and also some of the amazing electoral work that we've seen throughout the South, but, sort of especially Georgia. There's, I think, more recognition of the importance of the Southern electorate, and there's a lot of, or more money, increased funding around organizing and advocacy around, let's say, like integrated voter engagement. I don't know that has yet to translate to this kind of community building work that we're talking about. I see it more in terms of the electoral organizing and also some resistance work in the LGBTQ space as well. and perhaps some around abolitionism, which I think that there's also a way that one could frame the work that we're doing around food justice and Black food sovereignty within an abolitionist frame as well. Carlton?
Yeah, I would agree. I think, I think part of the context for that is, as Kolu said, since that summer of racial reckoning, we saw a large influx of resources to a number of organizations that were dealing with, specifically dealing with Black communities. And we're seeing the backlash to that as well with, the ruling that was just made on Monday regarding the organization in Atlanta that was giving out grants directly to, support to Black businesswomen, to say that is, basically questioning the legality of that. And we're going to see more and more of that. We saw that first happen on the agricultural front, where we saw there was $5 billion that was made available to Black farmers during the pandemic. That was blocked by a group of white farmers in Wisconsin that said it was unconstitutional for the government to make this particular body of funding available only to Black farmers. So, that kind of like began to be the precipice of this argument of reverse racism and reverse discrimination. And it's really taking a lot of hold and traction in our community. And as an arts community, we should be very concerned about this, and we should be working to mitigate the impact of those issues on our communities. I put all that in context to say that the South is where a lot of those things live, and institutionally and historically, the South has been the battleground for a lot of these racial issues. And so more attention needs to be paid to what's happening here, so that the country knows how to take its cues.
Thank you so much. And we have 2 more questions here that came in our Q&A, and now I'm seeing them also in our chat. But how does a person with a small acreage of land, about 5 acres, get involved? And then that person's follow-up is, how can persons receive funding for, quote, preserving large trees in rural Black Alabama?
So I think that's a very specific question, which I'm more than happy to spend some time speaking directly to you, Myrna, about that. It probably is. This is not the greatest place or space to try to answer that, but there's a lot of local resources. I would start with the Alabama Federation of Cooperatives. I would start with a lot of the folks who are in Alabama, specifically the Federation of Southern Cooperatives in the space that is EPS Alabama, that specifically has someone there that works with trees and forest management, that could really be supportive and helpful to the work that you're asking about.
And then we do have one more question. We'll probably end here, but they said, I'm not sure how to frame this as a question, but I'm really interested in hearing more about the place of intersection between farming, food and food systems, and art, artists, cultural workers in the community of building individual and community self-determination.
I love that question, and I love the, sort of admission that, it's like, how do we frame this? It's such a big question, and it really is central to the work that we do. I'm lucky to now work with a young farmer named Nia Kiara Cole, and they are a filmmaker and a documentarian, and consider themselves an artist, are part of the Southern Agrarian Youth Network, and are an active farmer on a farm collective with 2 other young farmers. And one of the things that we were talking about this topic, and one of the things that they shared with me is that, they're also involved in grain farming, which is, there's all this missing supply chain infrastructure. So on the economic side, there's a lot of opportunity for creating small scale infrastructure that can be community owned, community controlled, and lead to wealth development. And they also made the point that what Carlton was referring to, documenting the stories and the people, and also just sitting and crocheting. Farming is very hard work, and at the end of the day, they were sharing that, have friends that will just sit and crochet, or there's a fiber circle and they're using clay from the land to dye the cloth. One of the leaders of Saffron, Whitney J, is known to show up at meetings with their banjo and playing music. And so this intersection, it's not just about the economic development and community revitalization. Community revitalization is critical in the rural South because there has been outmigration, there is depopulation. And for young people to stay, they need to feel that sense of vibrancy. And that sense of vibrancy is not just commercial enterprises. It's coming together with people and making art together, and having that feeling of belonging and creativity and agency that comes when you're a creative. So that is something that I'm happy to share that Nia shared with me. But this is your area, Carlton, though, so.
Yeah, I think, so I don't think of it as an intersection. I think of it as that these things naturally have grown from each other. They've grown out of each other. So there's two words in agriculture. There's agro growing, and culture. And all arts and culture, in my perspective, emerges out of agriculture. Agriculture is the fundamental tenet of human civilization. There's no human civilization exists without agriculture. So agriculture is the foundation for the development of arts and culture. And so to me, it's not an intersection. It is like a nesting doll. The more you dig into the art, the more you recognize that the art that is being created is a representative and a symbol of the culture that it's a part of. And that culture is always going to be rooted in some type of agricultural practice. So the best example I can give of that is here in Mississippi. We have the blues, and the blues is a music and a culture that emerged from the Black experience that is very much connected to both freedom and plantation culture. Not coming out of plantation culture, but this emergence out of plantation culture into freedom, into this idea that freedom was this new thing that was going to provide us with everything that we needed as newly free African descendants. And the disappointment that came along with recognizing that in freedom, we were still in bondage. And the blues were the artistic response to that. And those songs come out of field hollers. Those field hollers go back into Africa as part of a tradition of singing as cultivation of land was taking place. All of those things are one. They're not separate. We've separated them. So for me, arts and culture is not separate from agriculture. They're all one and the same.
Yeah, thank you so much. We have a few other questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to keep going if Carlton and Kolu, that's okay with y'all. We have one that says, noticing the wonderful design and branding shown on the Homegrown brand and Main Street Cultural Center. How are you connecting to both design and agriculture, and how does the community energy change when presented with something new?
Thank you for the question, Evan. So I would say first and foremost, we started our work in the development of subculture with designers as our primary partners, designers and architects. So we work with the Gulf Coast Community Design Studio. And as we would have conversations with the community, we would immediately translate those answers and those engagements into designs for how our community could respond to the concerns and the challenges and the problems that the community had identified they need to be working on. So we've been working with designers and architects from day one. I think the way that we're connecting that with art agriculture is that the first thing that everybody said they needed was a grocery store. That the primary issue in our community was the lack of access to food. And the reason why that was such an issue is because this community has this long history. It was built as a community that was built around agriculture and agricultural production. So the community that people produced mostly 85 to 90% of the food that they ate. And over time, within my lifetime, that has changed to a community no longer even having a grocery store, and the only place to get groceries locally is the Dollar General. Otherwise, you have to travel 20 miles in one direction, a minimum of 20 miles in one direction to get to a grocery store. So that is the crux of the engagement and the way that we think about design and architecture and agriculture. The community, I think, is constantly through stories. The community is constantly rediscovering itself, rediscovering what it's already accomplished. If it only sees, as a young generation is coming up, when you ask them about Utica, they give you a very specific answer because they've only seen Utica in its declined state. But if you begin to talk to people that are older, that have a relationship with Utica when it was in a very different state, they give you a bunch of different ways that the community used to exist, a myriad of different ways in which the community was sourcing food. So we've done research projects. We did a project with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation called Equitable Food Futures, in which we looked at the role of storytelling and how it impacts a community's ability to make decisions about their food ecosystem. And so we're connecting directly stories and narratives with agriculture and food production to make those pieces tie in for the community so that they can see their own knowledge and be aware of their own experience and information in these areas to harness that towards building a different type of future.
Yeah, thank you so much. Kolu, did you want to add to that one, or should we go to the next question here? Next question. All right. When you talk about community building, what would be first steps for a team under 5 years? Also, what role do you see spiritual communities in culture building? I'm in Snellville, Georgia.
Okay, now I'm looking for that. What would be first steps for a community? Yeah, the first steps, I mean, so this is like on the ground, how to build the grounded community. It's kind of like for the fund. It's really getting to know the people that you're involved with. It's been the groups that we see, it's been a long process of, as Carlton described, unearthing the stories that are already there, telling stories with each other, spending time on the land. There's a thing about seasonality, right? You don't just go to a piece of land and start mapping out what you want. You need to experience the land. You need to kind of hear what it's telling you, even research the history of the land. Who was living there before? What is the history of racial justice and injustice on that land? In order for that history to be kind of respected and inform a justice-based practice of community building in the present and going into the future, that needs to be understood. So I think a combination, I'll just say, two things: the combination of research about the land, which can be a lot story-based, but also going to the county courthouse and looking up records of ownership and all of that. And then the sharing and building deep relationships.
Yeah, thank you so much. And then our last question, do you have any advice for someone who is looking to connect farmers in Africa and America through the arts? I'm in Senegal. There are a lot of rich traditions to share.
Kolu, as someone who spends a lot of time in Africa, I would toss that one to you.
Yeah, I mean, I know that there's like the African Food Sovereignty Network. I think organizations are good entry points, so our organization is an entry point to multiple other organizations. You have our contact information. I'm sure that there's organizations in our ecosystem, including the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, which Carlton referred to. I know that there is an interest in sort of the diasporic experience and Pan-African solidarity. So I think that you'd find a lot of responsiveness and interest in the arts culture as it relates to agriculture and what could be shared. We do have cultural retentions that we're very proud of and that we build upon. A lot of people know about the Gullah Geechee communities, but those kinds of retentions exist and are evolved and built upon throughout the Americas.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much. We're going to shift into breakout rooms now, and we'll just have some of the GIA folks be there more so as observers, but we really want to give everyone some time to digest the content that we've been talking about today. And I'm going to go ahead and drop some questions in the chat, and then we'll also have those broadcasted into our breakout rooms. But just really thinking about how funders can establish trust-based relationships within this new sector of work, supporting land stewardship as part of cultural and economic self-determination, and then figuring out ways that funders can collaborate with other program areas in your organization, foundation, or the government for a more holistic and robust funding approach. So we will see you all back in about 15 minutes. And I think we're just going to take a moment. Eddie and Erica, I would love to hear. I have some stuff as well for my breakout room, but what are some of the takeaways that folks had today?
Erica, you would like to kick us off?
Sure. Well, my name is Erica Jones Craven. I am here based out of Atlanta, Georgia, just recognizing the Cherokee and Muskogee people who have claimed this land before I've been here. I had a really great conversation with my group and kind of just giving them a recap of the things that Carlton and Kolu highlighted. We talked a lot about what it looks like to involve the youth in these kind of conversations. We also talked about the intersectionality between the classroom, the home, and these organizations that actually are able to provide information and funding. Just talking about how no one or a lot of youth want to be involved, but like having those connections and information, there's not a lot of like kids who say, hey, I want to be a farmer, and bringing them into the programming to make sure that the lineage or the information is passed down. Ms. Tanisha brought up a really good point, who was in my group, speaking about how she is interested in getting more involved in land that's been passed down to her, but not having the information on how to really like use it to the best of her capabilities, or how to just manage it in general, but also how to get in touch with these organizations. And I think that Kolu and Carlton both provided a lot of insight into like tapping into these local communities and bridging the gap between the classroom and home. And just thinking about things like food deserts and how a lot of Black households maybe have their own personal garden in the back, and just kind of bringing that into the conversation. So I think it was a really good dialogue, just kind of, and Carlton and Kolu just really providing information on how it can start small and still have the resources. So I think each person had a lot to contribute, and thank you all so much for your information. And please feel free. I know a few of the members of my group weren't able to access the full discussion, but the full recording will be available to everyone after our webinar. And so just keep that in mind, and thank you all for attending.
Eddie, would you like to share?
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, and I'm coming from New York City, Lenapehoking, the unceded land of the Lenape, Munsee, and Wappinger people, as well as many others. In our breakout group, one person was talking about, they were basically thinking out loud about ways in their grant-making foundation to this work. So they were exploring the idea of maybe coming in through their work in support of environmental issues or their rural area working group. They also considered looking at folk arts and connecting folk arts to foodways and the intergenerational transfer of knowledge. So these were all really, really exciting opportunities. Another colleague was talking about social justice initiatives and how they have a next generation of board members at their foundation, and they have a greater appetite for risk and for boldness. And so they were talking about the possibility of exploring issues of food justice, and that they were seeing connections to the creative economy now thanks to this webinar. And then finally, someone was talking about being based in the West Coast and, being eager to explore connections between this work down in the South and the West Coast. But they were also, thinking out loud that on one hand, they could be doing this in the rural communities there in Northern California, but they could also look at urban farming in places like the Bay Area. And a colleague who actually works for the Minnesota Department of Agriculture actually was explaining that he is a consultant to BIPOC farmers in the Twin Cities, making that connection between the rural and the urban. So this was a great conversation. Thank you so much for everybody who was in my group. Jamie.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. So in our group, one person really brought up about how to reframe like people's idea and image of the South, not realizing a lot of people who don't live down there that it's still very rural, right? And so connecting, using like the connection with economic development with the work that's happening across the South, and how a lot of the disconnect that they feel comes not from ignorance of keeping agriculture separate from arts and culture, but rather people just don't know. Or yes, sorry, so it is ignorance, not pushback. People really don't know, but they are open to the concept. Someone else brought up, kind of in this preparation of how do we expand the dialogue amongst grant panelists and reviewers to understand that it's not a separate issue from arts and culture, to what discussions can be had within the community to encourage people to dismantle like the power dynamic between practitioner and funder. And then it was also mentioned, Ford Foundation has a really awesome grantee in Hawaii right now that is leasing land for about 10 years to create opportunities for young people in Hawaii to learn about how to farm on this land with the historic and pre-colonial Hawaiian methods of farming and food resources that have been since erased from the diet. So yeah, some really, really awesome discussion going on. And I just want to turn it back over to Carlton and Kolu for some closing thoughts before we conclude today's webinar.
Well,
Carlton,
so one, I just want to say thank you, Kolu, for agreeing to participate in this conversation. You and I spent a lot of time on Zoom together, so it's good to do this and be able to share more of the work that we're doing together and highlighting the larger body of work that is happening in the South. I also want to thank Eddie and the folks at GIA for making space for this conversation, for expanding the ideas that GIA holds as important to the arts and culture. It's really important that this conversation continue to grow and develop. And I hope that we find more fertile space within the GIA community to hold this conversation. I'm really eager for that. And I'm, glad that we're sharing this space where I feel like Kolu, I may be more of a mentor to you than most of the spaces that we're in together, where you're definitely my mentor. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Carlton. I really appreciate your inviting me to do this. And I love the openness of the group and the variety of questions. I guess my closing thought, and apologies for the background, I'm also doing elder care with my 92-year-old mom. And I'm sitting in their kitchen, so I don't have full control, but that the just transition, right, that we need to be all part of from the exploitive economy that is really undermining so many lives, I think most people's lives, into this future that we really have to imagine. Like, we don't really have a blueprint because it's not what has been. And that requires creativity on all fronts, and it requires experimentation. And so I just urge funders, even if you can't start with a radical trust-based participatory grant-making process like we do at the Southern Black Farmers Community-Led Fund, there are ways you can begin to experiment and integrate, community leaders and grassroots folks with lived experience of the issue areas through which you're doing your funding into your grant making process. And I think that that is the place to start. And in terms of opening your minds and of the panelists that you may be working with, going back to what Carlton said about looking beyond intersectionality and really thinking in terms of these nested systems that really are integrated, right? So that there's a way in which the Western sort of science, the separation between science and art and industry and versus creativity, that there's all these kinds of silo, and philanthropy we know is full of silos. And just taking those steps to go beyond the silos, and the impact on the ground is really tremendous when we do that, because people's lives are not just intersectional, they are nested. They are, we were just talking about the blues coming from the singing traditions in Africa, in the fields, the arts being part of spiritual expression. So I would just say, take whatever steps you can take in this direction, and the rest will follow. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you both. Thank you, Kolu, Carlton. Thank you to Erica and Eddie for helping facilitate our breakout rooms. And of course, thank you to Jessica, our wonderful tech support for today. I just want to end real quick by saying the work of grantmakers in the arts is not merely about allocating resources. It's about reshaping the very fabric of grant-making systems ingrained in racial capitalism. In closing, today's webinar has illuminated the profound intersections between art, activism, and economic justice. This discussion reminds us of the importance of solidarity, both within and beyond institutional boundaries, as we collectively strive to dismantle oppressive systems and pave the way for genuine systemic change. GIA's call to identify, interrupt, and create other ways of being and grant making serves as a catalyst for transformative change, urging us all to disrupt entrenched patterns of power and embrace a more equitable and inclusive future. We encourage you to provide us with feedback about your experience through the survey link in the chat. And webinar registrants will also receive a follow-up email with resources today from our speakers, and then also a recording of today's webinar that we encourage you to share widely and use as a resource when you are having these conversations with people. And then we hope that you can join us for our next webinar on June 18th, which is Agency, Autonomy, and Affirmation, Empowering Cultural Self-Determination in Trans and Queer BIPOC Communities. And I think Jessica's pulling up our slide right now, which also has a QR code to the feedback survey. But thank you all so much for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Take care. The Lord did